Ghost Hawk: The Reckoning Part 1. The Hawk lands. The coin sat on the edge of a metal desk in an empty room. No one had touched it in 72 hours. The morning light came through a single window, hitting the worn surface at an angle that made the engraving catch a hawk wing spread, head turned slightly left. On the reverse side, a serial number stamped deep into the metal, GH-07114. The edges were smooth from years of handling. Whoever carried this had held it thousands of times. In the dark. In silence. In places where coins like this meant something that could not be spoken aloud. Master Sergeant Orrin Bassett stood in the doorway. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades carrying heavy things across difficult terrain. His face had the quality of weathered oak, hard-lined, but not brittle. He looked at the coin for a long time without moving. Then he looked at the floor, then at the empty bunk. The gear bag was gone. The only thing left behind was the coin placed deliberately on the desk corner, as if it had been set down by someone who intended to come back for it, or someone who knew they would not need it anymore. Bassett crossed the room in 4 steps. He did not pick the coin up. He just stood over it, jaw tight, breathing slowly. Outside the window, Fort Liberty was waking up. The sounds of a base at dawn, engines, boots on pavement, the distant bark of a drill instructor somewhere across the compound. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place that had no idea what had just passed through it. Bassett finally reached down and turned the coin over with one finger, GH-07114. He straightened up, looked out the window at the parade ground, at the flagpole, at the pale Carolina sky, turning from gray to blue. His expression was the expression of a man doing the math on something he had not fully understood until this moment. 72 hours earlier, he would have told you he had seen everything this army had to offer. He would have been wrong. 3 days before Captain Sarah Decker arrived at Fort Liberty with a standard-issue duffel bag, a manila folder of transfer orders, and the stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago not to advertise what they carried. She was 29 years old, 5'4", 119 pounds, dark hair pulled into a regulation bun, so tight it looked carved. Her eyes were gray-blue, the color of a sky deciding whether to storm. Her face read as young at first glance until you looked longer and noticed something behind the eyes that was not young at all. The transfer orders listed her as a liaison intelligence officer. Previous postings: Fort Meade, Ramstein Air Base, Germany. Military occupational specialty, intelligence analysis. No combat deployments listed. No advanced weapons qualification. No field operations of record. The kind of file that made commanders assume they already knew everything about the person inside it. She signed in at the main gate at 06:30 on a Tuesday morning. The duty sergeant stamped her paperwork, handed back her credentials, and pointed her toward the liaison billets without looking up from his clipboard. She crossed the compound in the early light, duffel on one shoulder folder under her arm, moving at the measured pace of someone who had calculated the most efficient route before taking the first step. She did not look around at the base with the wide eyes of someone new. She looked around with the quiet, systematic attention of someone running a reconnaissance. Nobody noticed. She found her quarters a room with a steel-framed bunk and a metal desk and a window that faced the parade ground. She set her duffel on the floor. She opened it and removed a small photograph, placed it face down on the desk. She removed a worn challenge coin from the inside zipper pocket and set it beside the photograph. Then she turned the photograph over. A man in uniform standing in front of a vehicle at a forward operating base. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the same gray eyes she had. Written on the back in neat block letters, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. 2008, Chief Warrant Officer Gerald Decker, 75th Ranger Regiment. She had been 13 when that photograph was taken. She had been 16 when they told her he was not coming home. She held the photograph for a moment, then set it down. Her thumb moved to the coin, turned it once, set it beside the photograph. She had 17 minutes before morning formation. She dressed in physical training gear, checked her reflection once, and walked out. Colonel Dre Hollister descended from the reviewing platform at 06:45 the way a man descended when he wanted everyone to feel the weight of his approach. He was 52, lean in the way that some career officers went lean, not athletic but stripped down as if ambition had consumed everything unnecessary. He had been at Fort Liberty for 3 years and had spent most of that time constructing an environment that ran precisely to his specifications. His morning inspections were carefully designed theater, and he was good at them. 60 officers and trainees stood in formation on the concrete parade ground. The October air was cold enough to see breath, cold enough that the concrete had a faint sheen of overnight moisture. Hollister moved down the first row at a deliberate pace, stopping occasionally, saying nothing that mattered, saying it in a voice calibrated to carry. He reached the second row. He stopped. At the center of the formation, Captain Sarah Decker stood with her hands loose at her sides, eyes forward, expression flat. On the left side of her gray PT shirt, barely visible in the early light, was a small dark stain. Engine grease or something close to it. Hollister stopped in front of her. He was quiet for a moment, the pause before the first cut letting the silence do the initial work. Then he spoke loudly enough that the entire formation could hear. "Captain, that shirt." Sarah said nothing. "Do you see this?" He gestured toward the stain, turning slightly to address the formation as much as her. "This is what happens when standards erode. When we allow certain," he paused, "distractions to take precedence over basic military bearing." The formation shifted almost imperceptibly. A few faces showed the careful blankness of people suppressing a reaction. A few showed less care. Hollister clasped his hands behind his back and looked at Sarah the way a man looked at something he had already decided was beneath his time. Then he raised his voice. "Corporal Stovall, front and center." Most Reed Stovall was 26 years old and 240 pounds. He had played linebacker at a state school in Georgia and had carried that identity into the military the way some men carried a trophy, always visible, always relevant to his understanding of his own importance. He stepped forward with the swagger of someone accustomed to being called upon for physical things. "Sir," Hollister waved a hand towards Sarah without looking at her. "Inspect the captain's undershirt. Verify it meets uniform regulation." The pause that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, 3 separate things happened. Stovall hesitated, calculating. The formation waited collectively, understanding what was actually being ordered. And Sarah Decker inhaled slowly, held it, exhaled in a controlled and measured rhythm, and did not move. Stovall moved behind her. His voice carried false courtesy, the kind designed to demonstrate to the audience that the speaker was at least acknowledging the performance. "Ma'am, this'll just be a second." He grabbed the back of her collar with both hands and yanked hard. The tearing of fabric was loud, absurdly loud in the cold morning air, like the sound had no business being that sharp in that silence. The shirt split from the neckline down to the middle of Sarah's back, the seam giving way cleanly, and the cold October air hit exposed skin. What it exposed silenced the formation completely. Ink. Dense, intricate, covering the entire expanse of her back from shoulder blade to shoulder blade. A hawk massive, rendered in extraordinary detail, wings spread to their full width, each feather shaded individually to catch light and cast shadow. The head was turned slightly left. The talons were curled, not in aggression but in readiness, the readiness of something that had not yet decided to strike. At the center of the bird's chest, text too small to read from a distance. Along the underside of both wings, more text arranged with the precision of something that meant something specific to someone. This was not the work of a tattoo parlor. This was not a design chosen from a binder on a Saturday afternoon. This was craftsmanship, the kind that took hours across multiple sessions, the kind that carried the weight of having been chosen with great deliberation. The laughter started gradually, the way laughter in formations started, one person finding the nerve first, then others following the sound, building itself out of social permission. "That's something," someone muttered. "She bring that from the zoo." More laughter. Hollister stepped back, arms crossed, allowing it. He tilted his head at a mock-appreciative angle, studying the tattoo with theatrical consideration. "I'll give you credit, Captain. In a certain light, that is impressive." He paused for the timing. "How much did that run you? More than your signing bonus, I'd wager." The formation laughed harder. Stovall, still holding the torn fabric, grinned wide. Sarah had not moved. Her hands were loose at her sides. The cold air moved across her exposed back, and she stood in it, without acknowledgement, without tightening, without any visible response to the cold, or to the sound around her. Her breathing had not changed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. 4 counts held. Repeat. Hollister leaned slightly forward, squinting at the text near the bird's chest. He could not quite make it out from where he stood. "What does it say?" "Something motivational, love, laugh, soar." He straightened up, letting the formation's laughter answer for him. "People decorate themselves to compensate for what they lack. You can put anything on your skin. You cannot put experience there. You cannot put competence there. What matters is what you have done, not what you have drawn on yourself." He looked at Sarah one final time, dismissive, conclusive. "Get a new shirt, Captain. This is a military installation." He turned and walked back toward the platform. Behind him, Sarah exhaled. 4 counts out. She turned and walked toward the barracks. Her back remained straight. Her pace did not change. In the back row of the formation, two men had not laughed. Master Sergeant Orrin Bassett stood with his arms folded, watching Sarah walk away with the focused attention of a man trying to solve something. 32 years in uniform had given him a precise internal instrument for detecting things that did not fit their context. Something about that tattoo did not fit. The style, the technique, the way the ink sat in the skin, not the slightly raised quality of commercial work, but flat embedded, the kind that resulted from sessions done in environments where sterile and convenient were aspirational rather than guaranteed. He had seen tattoos like that before, not often, in specific kinds of places, on specific kinds of people. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Nate Wexford stood very still. He was 29 years old, a SEAL with a service record that had moved him through the ranks faster than the system usually allowed, assigned to Fort Liberty as liaison for a joint training rotation. He had the active quiet of someone who had learned to observe before acting, every movement considered, nothing wasted. He was looking at the spot where Sarah had stood, and his expression was controlled in the specific way that controlled expressions were not neutral. They were held. Bassett said low enough that only Wexford could hear, "Something on your mind, Commander." Wexford was quiet for a moment. The way she stood when he grabbed her collar. A pause. She did not flinch, did not pull back, just stood there like she was absorbing it. Bassett said nothing, waiting. "I have seen that kind of stillness before. In people who have been through SERE training." He said it carefully, "the specific kind that teaches you to receive without reacting." Bassett looked at the space Sarah had occupied. Then he looked at Wexford. "You think she is something other than what her file says?" Wexford did not answer directly. He watched the barracks doors close behind Sarah. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moved when something was being worked out behind the eyes. "That tattoo," he said finally. "The positioning, the detail level." He stopped. "I need to look at something." He walked away before Bassett could ask what. In the barracks bathroom, Sarah stood in front of a mirror mounted slightly too high on the wall, the kind of institutional fixture that never quite lined up for people of her height. She looked at the reflection of her back. The hawk looked back. In the fluorescent light, it looked different than it did in morning sunlight, sharper the shadows, deeper, the text along the wings more legible. She had lived with this image for 7 years. She had stopped seeing it as a tattoo a long time ago. It was more like a fact, a biographical detail rendered in ink, as permanent and non-negotiable as everything else it represented. She turned away from the mirror, reached into her cargo pocket, and removed the challenge coin. Turned it twice in her fingers without looking at it. The metal was warm from her body. It was always warm. She had carried it for 5 years, since the day someone had handed it to her at the end of something she was not allowed to discuss, in exchange for something she was not allowed to confirm had happened. On the desk, the photograph. On the desk, this coin. Between them, the distance of 13 years. She set the coin on the sink edge, pulled a fresh shirt from under the bunk, dressed. Looked at herself in the mirror one more time, not vanity assessment. Everything in place. Expression neutral. Breathing controlled. Then for the first time that morning, something changed in her face. Not much, not enough for most people to read. A fractional shift at the corners of her mouth, something that knew something, something that had the quality of patience being confirmed. The quality of a plan proceeding exactly as intended. She pocketed the coin, walked out. Lieutenant Cass Marrow had the group chat running before breakfast. He was 31, a signals officer with a talent for making information travel faster than it was supposed to. The first message was a crudely drawn bird with a caption that would have gotten a civilian fired. Within 40 minutes, 30 people had joined. The jokes multiplied with the momentum that institutional cruelty always found when a target had not fought back. Sarah saw none of it. She was in the mess hall eating. Chicken, rice, vegetables. Eating with the methodical attention of someone who thought of food as fuel and structured the intake accordingly. 4 bites. Water. 4 bites. Repeat. She did not look at the other tables. She did not acknowledge the glances. She ate, she noted, she filed. Who laughed loudest? Who followed? Who looked uncomfortable and looked away? Who did not participate? This was not incidental. This was the work. Bassett watched her from the serving line. He had spent 32 years watching soldiers eat and had learned that the way a person ate told you things about what they had been through. Sarah ate like someone who had learned to make meals count because they did not always come when scheduled. He had seen that before. In men who had come back from extended field operations where regular food was a luxury rather than an assumption. He carried his tray to a table and sat down and thought about the tattoo and about Wexford's face when the shirt tore. Major Glenn Partridge sat down across from him. Partridge ran administration for the training rotation, a competent bureaucrat with the instincts of a man who kept his head down by professional philosophy. He looked tired. "Heard about this morning," Partridge said, not looking at Bassett. Bassett said nothing. "Colonel wants a watch kept on her. Officially, it is about performance standards." Partridge stirred his coffee. "Unofficially, it is about making sure she decides to request a transfer before anyone has to do anything formal." Bassett looked at his tray. "What has she done that makes him that worried?" Partridge looked up briefly. "That is the thing. As far as I can tell, nothing. She got here yesterday." He looked back down. "But Hollister does not usually move this fast unless something specific is bothering him." Bassett filed that and did not comment. Across the mess hall at a table by herself, Sarah Decker took 4 more bites of rice and drank her water and did not look up. The kill house sat at the eastern edge of the range complex, a concrete structure with no windows and a reputation for breaking people who came into it with assumptions about their own abilities. Sergeant Pete Holt had been running the facility for 8 years and had watched Tier 1 operators, Green Berets, Rangers, and SEAL instructors move through it. He had seen extraordinary shooting, and he had seen catastrophic failures, and he had a well-calibrated internal meter for the difference. At 0800, Hollister's training directive placed Captain Sarah Decker with the range rotation. Sarah arrived at the kill house to find her gear waiting. She looked at it without expression. An M4 carbine with a scratched stock and sights that a trained eye could see were slightly off-center. A tactical vest 2 sizes too large. An earpiece that produced static, whether it was turned on or not. All of it within regulation. None of it what you would hand to someone you wanted to succeed. The team assigned to her rotation was led by Staff Sergeant Derek Mays, experienced professional skeptical in the specifically professional way of a man who had learned to be skeptical of assignments that did not make tactical sense. His team corporal Justin Hale and specialist Frank Tober flanked him, reading the situation the same way he was. Mays spoke to Sarah directly. "Captain, I will be honest with you. At this level does not cross over from desk work. If you are not comfortable, there is no mark against you for stepping out." "I will manage," Sarah said. The words were flat, not dismissive, settled. The words of someone who had already done the risk calculation and arrived at a conclusion they were not interested in debating. Mays looked at her for a moment, then he briefed the drill. 3-room clear. Mixed threat and non-threat targets. Sarah as rear security. Stay back, maintain spacing. Do not shoot anyone by accident. The buzzer. They stacked and breached. The first room cleared in 6 seconds. 2 threat targets. Clean. They moved to the second room. The 4th threat target in the second room had been repositioned by range staff between the last run and this one, a setup dressed as normal variants. It came up in a corner that put Hale's angle directly across a non-threat target. Hale froze. 3 seconds to a scored failure. Sarah moved left 2 steps. She did not rush it. She moved to the position that gave her the angle, brought the rifle up in a single economical motion, and fired once. The target dropped. The non-threat target was untouched. Hale stood with his rifle still raised, looking at the space where the problem had been. "How did you—" Sarah was already moving to the third room. Third room, 4 targets, 2 non-threats, tight geometry. She dropped to a knee without being told, changing her firing angle to create a shot solution that the standing positions could not access. 2 shots, 2 threat targets. Clean. Drill end. Holt's voice over the intercom. "Clear. Time 47 seconds. Silence. Previous facility record was 52 seconds, held by a SEAL instructor from the Dam Neck rotation in 2021. Nobody in the room moved for 3 seconds. Mays looked at his rifle. He looked at Sarah. She was clearing the weapon, ejecting the magazine, running through the post-drill procedure with the automated precision of someone whose hands had done this thousands of times before. She was not excited. She was not smiling. She looked like someone who had done a job they were expected to do and was now accounting for the equipment before moving on to the next task. Tober looked at Hale. Hale looked at Mays. Mays pulled out his phone and sent a text. In the observation booth above the range floor, Bassett had come without announcing himself on an instinct he could not have fully articulated. He told the technician to rewind the footage and play it at half speed. He watched Sarah's feet. The way she moved through the room, not the movement of someone who had practiced a specific drill, but the movement of someone whose body had internalized spatial problem-solving at a level that made conscious thought unnecessary. Pieing corners. Low ready carry between target engagements. the way she indexed off the door frame in the transition between rooms. Bassett had spent enough time around the people who trained operators to recognize what this was. This was not practice. This was the muscular memory of someone who had done this under conditions where getting it wrong meant something that could not be undone. He zoomed in on her hands, thumbs forward grip, elbows at a specific angle, a way of holding a long gun that he associated with very particular schools and very particular people, the kind of people whose training was measured not in courses completed, but in missions survived. He called Wexford. Wexford arrived 10 minutes later and watched the footage without comment. When it finished, he asked the technician to run the audio from the third room the moment before Sarah dropped to her knee, her voice barely audible, running a 4-count breath sequence between target acquisitions. Wexford went very still. He asked for it again. The technician ran it twice more. Wexford said nothing. He looked at the frozen image on the screen, Sarah's face completely calm, no adrenaline, no excitement, just someone doing a job they had done 1,000 times before. His phone lit up. 2 words to Bassett, "See me." He found Wexford in a room off the administration corridor, door closed. Wexford had a laptop open to a personnel database. His face was the face of a man who had found something he was both looking for and hoping not to find. He turned the screen so Bassett could read it. The record was sparse. Captain Sarah Decker, age 29, MOS Intelligence Analysis. Prior postings listed, no combat deployments, no advanced training records. Standard file, the kind that told you nothing because it had been designed to tell you nothing. At the bottom, a notation, small, the kind of thing you would miss without knowing what you were looking for. GH-07114. Ghost Hawk Intelligence Cell, status killed in action, April 2019. Record sealed. Bassett read it twice. She is listed as dead. For 5 years, Wexford said. Body never recovered. Listed as presumed KYMIA following extraction failure. He paused. I escalated to JSOC 20 minutes ago. They are sending a team. They told me to stay on the line and not engage her. He looked at Bassett. They were not surprised when I called. Bassett was quiet for a moment. They expected someone to find her eventually. Or they expected her to surface eventually. Wexford closed the laptop. She is not here by accident. She is not here because of some routine assignment. She chose to be here. He looked at the door. The audio from the kill house, the breathing cadence. I have heard that before. Bassett waited. Syria, 2017. I was on a convoy escort outside Aleppo. We took an IED hit. My Humvee flipped. I was trapped under the chassis bleeding, and I was going to stay there until the fire reached me, or the blood loss did. He stopped. His voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it now, something that had been living in a sealed compartment for 7 years. Someone pulled me out, small hands. She got me to cover and packed the wound and talked me through the breathing. Same cadence, exact same rhythm. He looked at Bassett. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. I just heard it again in that range audio. The room was very quiet. The analyst on that convoy, Bassett said. What happened to her? Listed as a civilian contractor. Identity redacted. I tried to find her afterward. Trail went completely cold. Wexford's jaw tightened. Because she was Ghost Hawk, and Ghost Hawk was sealed. Bassett looked at the closed laptop. She saved your life, and 2 years later someone ordered her mission aborted and got her killed. Got her listed as killed, Wexford said. There is a difference, he stood, and I think she is here because she knows the difference, and she knows why it happened, and she has been waiting a long time to prove it. Bassett thought about the group chat, about the mess hall, about 60 people laughing at a woman who had broken a SEAL instructor's range record 40 minutes later. She let him humiliate her, Bassett said. She let all of them, Wexford said. Bassett was quiet for a long time. Because if she had shown her hand on day 1, she would just be an officer with an interesting background. She needed him to show his. She needed him to act first, to establish a pattern that could only mean one thing. He looked at the laptop. She is not a liaison lieutenant commander. No, Wexford said. She is not. Bassett picked up his cover from the table. He stood in the stillness of a man revising his understanding of something he thought he already knew. 32 years of service had given him what he believed was a thorough map of how things worked and what people were capable of. He was discovering at 58 that the map had a blank space he had not known was there. He put his cover on. What do we do? Wexford looked at the door. We watch and we wait, same as her. Outside the window, the Fort Liberty parade ground lay empty in the mid-morning light. The flagpole cable moved against its housing in a light wind, making its small regular sound. In the barracks, in a room with a metal desk and a steel-framed bunk, a challenge coin sat on a corner hawk side up. Sarah Decker had been at Fort Liberty for one day. The plan was proceeding exactly as intended. Part 2, the hawk hunts. The word came down at 0900 on the second day. Specialist Dana Park, the rotation's primary cryptographer, had been admitted to the base medical facility at 00630 with a fever of 103 and symptoms consistent with food poisoning severe enough to keep her horizontal for at least 48 hours. A priority message had arrived from a forward coordination unit at MacDill Air Force Base, encrypted in a rotating cipher variant that required manual decoding before it could be entered into the base's automated systems. The message contained targeting coordinates for a live-fire drone exercise scheduled for 1400 hours. If the coordinates were not verified and transmitted by 1000, the exercise window closed. Hollister could have requested a replacement cryptographer from the base communications section. The wait time would have been 40 minutes, which would have cleared the deadline with time to spare. Instead, he summoned Sarah Decker to the communications center. She arrived to find the room full. Signals technicians at their stations, Lieutenant Marrow standing near the primary terminal with his arms folded, two other officers positioned near the back wall. The audience was not incidental. Hollister stood at the center of the room with the ease of a man who had already decided how the next 20 minutes would end. "Captain, we have a situation." He gestured toward the terminal, showing the encrypted text blocks of characters arranged in columns, visually inert to most eyes in the room. "Specialist Park is unavailable. You are the senior intelligence officer on site. The message needs decoding in 20 minutes. Sarah looked at the screen. The silence stretched to 3 seconds. Marrow shifted his weight. Someone near the back made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Hollister spread his hands in a gesture of courtesy that contained no courtesy. "Of course, headquarters can send a replacement in 40 minutes or so, if you are not comfortable." "I will try," Sarah said. She pulled a chair to the terminal. She looked at the encrypted text for exactly 10 seconds without touching the keyboard. Then she picked up the notepad on the desk beside the terminal and the pen clipped to it, and she began to write. Not copying, analyzing. Her hand moved in short, precise strokes, letters, numbers, frequency, tallies, cross-references against the message's timestamp embedded in the header block. The room watched. At 2 minutes, Marrow looked at his watch. At 5 minutes, the room had gone from barely suppressed amusement to something quieter and less comfortable. Sarah's pen did not stop. It did not slow. It moved with the confidence of a hand executing a procedure it had executed many times before in conditions where the margin for error was measured not in professional consequences, but in something more immediate and irreversible. Caesar variant. Rotating key. Timestamp seed. She had identified the cipher type in the first 40 seconds. She was now working through the decryption matrix by hand, stripping the encoding layer by layer, the way you did it when you had learned to do it without machines, because machines were not always available and the message always needed to be read. At 8 minutes, she stopped writing. She looked at what she had on the page for 3 seconds. Then she turned to the keyboard and typed a long string of characters into the decryption software. A manual override key entered with absolute certainty, not the hesitant typing of someone guessing. She hit enter. The screen changed. Clear text appeared. Coordinates, instructions, mission, parameters. Complete and accurate. The technician at the adjacent station leaned forward and read it. He sat back. That is the full message." He looked at Sarah. "How did you message is decoded?" Sarah tore the top sheet off the notepad and set it on the desk. "Transmit to the exercise coordinator." She stood, pushed the chair back, and walked out of the room. Total elapsed time, 11 minutes and 42 seconds. The room held its silence for 5 full seconds after the door closed. Marrow picked up the notepad sheet she had left behind. He looked at it. Both sides were covered in calculations, cipher wheels, drawn freehand frequency tallies, key derivation work shown in steps so clean and organized they looked like a textbook illustration. This was not the work of someone who had taken a weekend course. This was the work of someone who had done this under time pressure in environments where getting it wrong had consequences that a training rotation could not simulate. He looked at the page for a long time. In the lower right corner, barely visible, almost incidental, 2 letters and a number. NH7, small, precise, written in the same hand as the calculations, but with the quality of something automatic, something the hand did out of habit before the mind caught up. Marrow photographed it with his phone. He sent the image to Bassett without a message because he did not know what message to attach. Bassett was at the far end of the motor pool when the image arrived. He looked at it, forwarded it to Wexford with the two words, "Your database." Wexford was in the administration building. He had been spending more time there than his liaison duties required, running searches in the classified personnel system with the systematic patience of someone who believed they already knew what they were looking for and was simply building the documented case. NH7 returned one result. Nighthawk 7, Ghost Hawk Intelligence Cell, Operator Specialization Signals, Intelligence and Cryptography. Assignment Classification Redacted, Last Known Status. Killed in action, April 19, 2019. Record sealed under JSOC authority. He picked up his secure phone and made the call. The voice on the other end was level in the way that JSOC operations voices were level, professionally steady, carrying the quality of someone who understood that information was a tool and tools were neutral until someone decided how to use them. Lieutenant Commander Wexford, you flagged a sealed record. I believe one of the operators listed as KIA in the Ghost Hawk abort is currently active on site at Fort Liberty, operating under a rebuilt identity. A pause, not the pause of surprise, the pause of assessment. Stay on the line. Do not engage. Do not discuss this beyond current personnel. Another pause. You are not the first person to run this search, Commander. You may be the first to run it from that specific location. The line went quiet in the way that lines went quiet when someone was making additional calls on behalf of what had just been said. Wexford set the phone down and looked out the window at the parade ground. An officer crossing from the administrative block to the barracks, moving at a normal pace, carrying a folder, looking like exactly what her transfer orders said she was. He watched her until she disappeared through the barracks door. Sarah was alone at the range complex when he found her that afternoon. She had stayed after the day's scheduled training concluded, standing at the firing line with no weapon in her hands, running through movements in the air. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones, the micro adjustments of grip and stance that became permanent and only through repetition, so extensive that the body stopped needing the mind to authorize them. She heard him coming and stopped, turned. Her expression was the same flat neutrality she had worn since she arrived, the face of someone who had developed the ability to present nothing because nothing was always the correct thing to present when you did not yet know what the situation required. Wexford came to stand a few feet from her. He did not speak immediately. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a photograph. He placed it on the shooting bench between them. The photograph was printed on actual paper, slightly faded, the corners bent from having been folded and unfolded many times. It showed a convoy of vehicles on a road in flat, arid terrain, the picture taken from some elevation behind the convoy, the lead vehicle already partially visible. Written on the back in someone else's handwriting, Aleppo Corridor, October 2017. Sarah looked at the photograph. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way you looked at something that required a decision about what you were going to do next. I have been trying to find the person who pulled me out for 7 years, Wexford said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was deliberate. I was in that convoy, second vehicle, when the IED hit. The chassis came down on me and I could not move. There was fire. I was losing blood from my left leg and I was going to stay there until the fire reached me or the blood loss did. He stopped. Someone pulled me out. Small hands, strong. She got me behind the lead vehicle and she packed the wound and she talked me through the breathing while she waited for the medevac. Told me to breathe with her. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. He looked at Sarah. She kept me conscious for 19 minutes until the helicopter landed. I passed out before I could see her face. Sarah had not moved. The official report listed her as a civilian contractor. Identity redacted. I had a friend in records check the files twice. Trail was completely clean. He paused. I found out why yesterday. Sarah looked at the photograph for a long time. The light was going flat in the late afternoon, the range complex casting long shadows across the concrete. How old were you? She said finally. 22. The silence between them held the weight of things that were known but not yet spoken. The breathing cadence, Sarah said. Where did you hear it again? Range audio? Yesterday, from the kill house. Same voice, same rhythm. I have heard it in my sleep for 7 years. Sarah was quiet. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then she looked at Wexford with an expression that was not confirmation and not denial, but something more complicated than either, the expression of someone who understood that a line was being approached and was calculating in real time what crossing it would cost. She picked up the photograph, held it for a moment, set it back down on the bench. Get some sleep, Lieutenant Commander, she said. She walked away from the range without looking back. Her pace was even. Her shoulders were straight. Wexford stood at the shooting bench for a long time after she was gone. He looked at the photograph. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. His hands were completely steady. His chest was not. The extraction drill was scheduled for the following morning at 700. Hollister delivered the briefing personally, which was unusual enough that the people in the room noted it. He explained the scenario with the thoroughness of a man who wanted no questions afterward about whether proper procedures had been followed. A two-story warehouse structure on the western edge of the compound. A high-value target role player in an orange vest secured somewhere inside. Enemy role players with simunition rounds. The assigned Team Bassett's rotation group, which meant Sarah Stovall, Marrow Specialist Ray Holbrook, and Private First Class Kobe Lentz, who had been cleared for light duty following surgical repair of his leg. Hollister had specifically added Lentz to the manifest over Bassett's unspoken objection, not because Lentz was ready, but because Hollister understood that an injured soldier in a live drill created variables that a desk officer in theory would not be equipped to manage. Enemy presence, light resistance. Time window 30 minutes. Bassett looked at the briefing map. He had been in the Army for 32 years, and one of the things that 32 years had given him was the ability to identify when a map was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way, wrong in the way that things were wrong when someone had made adjustments. They did not want noticed a staircase in a position that did not match the footprint, a corridor that should not exist given the exterior dimensions of the structure. He said nothing. At 700, the team assembled at the warehouse entrance. Hollister was absent. Partridge stood near the objective control post with a clipboard watching. The role players were already inside. Stovall was nominally team leader by rank, a fact that did nothing to make the situation more coherent. His brief was short. Fast entry clear by room sweep, each floor extract the HVT. Sarah stood at the back of the huddle and listened and said nothing. She looked at the map one time, noted the discrepancy between what it showed and what the exterior of the building told her, and filed it. The buzzer sounded. They breached. The interior was wrong from the first second. The hallway that the map showed ending at 10 meters continued past 15. The staircase the map placed on the left was on the right. The first room was clear. The second room had 2 role players, which the team handled cleanly. The third room had 6. Stovall called it fast. More contacts than briefed. Fall back, regroup. It was the right call, and it was too late. The role players spread quickly. Holbrook took 3 simunition rounds to the chest and was out of the drill. Lentz, moving faster than his cleared status warranted, took 2 to the back. Marrow was cut off in the northeast corridor and could not reestablish contact. Stovall rounded a corner into a cluster of 3 role players and took a round to the shoulder that ended his effective participation. The radio. Sarah keyed it on the standard frequency. Static, heavy uniform wall-to-wall static. Not the static of poor reception, the static of active jamming. She was alone. 1 hostile contact visible in the corridor, ahead 2 more sounds of movement behind her. The HVT was somewhere on the 2nd floor based on the footstep pattern she had been tracking since the breach. The map was useless. The radio was useless. The drill had been constructed to produce a specific outcome, and everyone who had designed it believed she had exactly the resources that her file said she had. She stood in the corridor for 2 seconds. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her vest. Not the standard issue radio pouch. A secondary pocket sewn in, not part of the original vest configuration. She removed a radio that was not standard training issue, smaller, ruggedized, the kind of compact communications device that came from procurement channels not available to liaison officers. She checked the frequency setting, preset, not requiring adjustment. She keyed the mic. Her voice changed. Not loudly, but the register shifted, the pace shifted, the quality of every word shifted from the slightly tentative delivery she had used for 2 days straight to something flat and precise and entirely without hesitation. The voice of someone who had made calls like this before in buildings where the stakes were calibrated differently. Nighthawk 7 to Overwatch. Request immediate extract. Grid November Whiskey 4721. 5 personnel, 1 HVT, 1 casualty status. Authenticate Tango Hotel November. Silence on the channel for 4 seconds. Then a voice, calm, brief, carrying the quality of someone who had been waiting for exactly this call. Nighthawk 7 authentication confirmed. QRF inbound. ETA 90 seconds. Sarah pocketed the radio. She moved to a covered position at the quarter junction weapon, up watching both approaches. Her posture had shifted completely. The slight forward lean of someone unsure of their environment was gone. She stood with the rooted stillness of a person who owned the space they occupied, who had assessed every angle and was simply waiting for the next variable to present itself. The door at the end of the corridor blew inward. 4 men entered the warehouse. No unit markings, no identifying insignia. Full tactical kit weapons at the ready, moving through the space in a formation that covered every angle simultaneously, the kind of movement that took years to build and more years to make automatic. They cleared the ground floor in 11 seconds. One of them went up the staircase. 22 seconds later, he came back down with the HVT, the roll-up player in the orange vest looking considerably bewildered by the pace at which his morning had accelerated. The lead operator looked at Sarah. He did not speak. He nodded once, a small, precise, professional acknowledgement of the kind exchanged between people who understood each other's work. And then he and his 3 colleagues were moving toward the exit, taking the HVT with them. And 40 seconds after they had entered the warehouse, they were gone. Total operation time from Sarah's radio call, 91 seconds. Stovall stood in the middle of the warehouse with paint on his shoulder and his mouth open. He looked at the door. He looked at the space where 4 people had been and were no longer. He looked at Sarah, who was already clearing her weapon and conducting the post-exercise equipment check with the same methodical pace she applied to everything. "Who?" Stovall said, and then stopped because the sentence did not have a direction he could take it that would make sense. Marrow, who had found his way back from the northeast corridor, stood in the doorway. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the exit. He said nothing. Sarah holstered her sidearm. "We debrief in 10 minutes. Her voice carried the clean authority of someone who had stopped pretending. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Stovall stared at her. She walked past him toward the exit. He followed. In the observation booth above the warehouse floor, a camera had recorded everything. Bassett sat in front of the monitor replay, watching the moment Sarah reached into the interior pocket of her vest. He watched the shift in her posture. He watched the way she held the radio, the practiced grip of someone whose hands had found that specific device in that specific configuration in complete darkness more than once. He watched the 4 operators enter and move through the space, and he noted their kit, their formation, their movement signature. He knew what JSOC Quick Reaction Force looked like. You did not deploy QRF assets to a training exercise. You did not deploy QRF assets to anything short of a situation with real operational stakes. The people who had walked through that warehouse door were not role players. They had been staged close enough to reach that warehouse in 90 seconds, which meant they had been staged there before the drill began. Bassett picked up his phone and called Wexford. "I need the financial records on Hollister," he said. "Whatever you can access legitimately from JSOC's end." Wexford was quiet for a moment. "I have already requested them. And the results are coming through now." A pause. "Sergeant Major, there is a shell company, registered in Delaware under a name that does not connect to Hollister directly. But the registered agent is his wife's maiden name, Garrison." Bassett was very still. "When was it set up?" 2018. "It has received periodic deposits over 6 years, amounts calibrated to remain below standard automated flagging thresholds." Wexford paused again. "And one large one, April 10th, 2019, $200,000. The date landed like something physical. 2 days before the Ghost Hawk abort order, Bassett said. The source traces through 3 holding companies before it dead ends at a financial entity incorporated in Cyprus. JSOC's Financial Intelligence Unit flagged that Cyprus entity 2 years ago. It is part of the operational funding network for a man named Alexei Braun. Wexford's voice was level. Braun is an arms broker operating primarily out of Eastern Europe, on the DoD watch list since 2015. One of his procurement clients had an active interest in the failure of Operation Vulture, because Vulture, had it succeeded, would have resulted in the capture of a logistics coordinator essential to Braun's chain. Bassett looked at the frozen image on the monitor, Sarah's back the moment before she reached for the second radio. The hawk across her shoulders, wings spread. 3 operators died in that extraction, Bassett said. Yes, because air support was pulled, because exfil assets were redirected. He stopped. Because someone made a phone call 2 days after receiving $200,000. That is what the timeline says. Bassett was quiet for a long time. She knows all of this. She has known it for 5 years, Wexford said. She has been building the documented case since she walked through the front gate. Every insult, every order, every piece of gear handed to her damaged on purpose, she needed all of it on record. She needed him to establish a pattern of conduct so clear it could only mean one thing. He was trying to eliminate an officer he supposedly did not know, which only made sense if her presence here was a threat he understood. Wexford paused. There is one more thing. Lieutenant Marrow has been trying to access Partridge's email archive. He found something. Marrow was waiting outside the administration building when Bassett arrived. He held a printed page in his hand and had the look of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for several hours and had finally decided that carrying it alone was worse than the alternative. He held out the page without preamble. I accessed Partridge's server. I know I did not have authorization. I will take whatever that costs. He pointed at the page. Read the third paragraph. It was an email thread. The bottom message was from an external sender. The address routed through a relay that obscured the origin but carried a header signature that a trained eye would recognize as coming from within a classified communications network. The message was brief, the kind of brief that represented deliberate compression, someone choosing words carefully because they were creating a record they might need to reference later. The subject line was blank. The body read Asset Reactivated per JSOC Directive, Identity Rebuilt, Assignment Pending. You should assume she is coming. The date stamp was 11 days before Sarah Decker signed in at the Fort Liberty main gate. Bassett read it twice. Hollister received this. Partridge forwarded it to him within 4 minutes of it arriving. Marrow pointed to the top of the thread, and then looked at Hollister's response. The response was 3 lines. Bassett read them again. The first line, who is it? The second line, doesn't matter. If they're coming here, they're coming for me. Neutralize before they establish. The third line, do not document further. Bassett lowered the page. He looked at the administration building entrance. Hollister had known someone from Ghost Hawk was coming before Sarah arrived. He had not known it was her specifically. He had not needed to. The knowledge that an asset had been reactivated was enough to tell him what the reactivation was for. He had moved against Sarah within hours of her arrival with a speed and conviction that had looked like arrogance but was something more specific. It was fear. The fear of a man who understood exactly what he had done and had been waiting 5 years for the consequences to arrive. Sarah had let him be afraid. She had let him act on that fear. She had stood on the parade ground and let Stovall tear her shirt while Hollister performed for 60 people, and she had breathed through it and said nothing and noted everything, because every action Hollister took against an officer who had done nothing wrong was another brick in a structure that would hold weight when the time came to put weight on it. Bassett handed the page back to Marrow. Keep this secure. No one outside myself and Lieutenant Commander Wexford. Marrow nodded. He started to say something, stopped, started again. I set up the group chat. First minute. I was in it from the beginning. He looked at the ground. I did not think. I just followed the room. Bassett said nothing. That is worse, is it not? Marrow said. Bassett looked at him for a moment. What you do next is what matters, not to me. To you. He turned toward the building. Keep that page safe. He walked inside. That evening, Hollister made 2 phone calls. The first was to Partridge. The conversation was short, and the recording Sarah made of it was clean. She sat in her quarters with the small device she had carried for 3 weeks in the interior pocket of her jacket, and she listened through an earpiece to a man who had received $200,000 in 2019, telling his administrative officer to find a formal mechanism to transfer, fail, or remove a captain who was causing problems. She used an unauthorized communications device in a sanctioned exercise, Hollister said. That is a conduct issue. Document it. Partridge, sir, if I may, the QRF response time suggests the device was JSOC authorized. If I document it in JSOC contradicts the characterization. Document it. The recording ran for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Sarah stopped the device. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at nothing specific. 3 operators, 2019. An extraction that was going as planned until air support was pulled without warning, until the exfiltration vehicles that were supposed to be at Grid November Whiskey were not there, until 3 people who had followed orders and trusted the chain of command above them found out in the final minutes of their lives that the chain had a broken link and the break had been bought and paid for. She thought about their names. She did not say them aloud. She did not need to. They were the first thing she thought about when she woke up in the morning and the last thing she thought about when she closed her eyes at night, and they had been for 5 years, and they would be until this was finished. She set the recording device on the desk beside the challenge coin. The coin, the photograph, the device, the 3 things she had brought with her to Fort Liberty. The coin because it was her father's mission continued. The photograph because it was the reason she was doing this. The specific way she was doing it for the people who were not here to see it concluded. The device because justice required evidence, and evidence required discipline, and discipline meant never letting them see you reaching for what you needed. She put the recording device in her pocket. She lay down on the bunk. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, 4 counts held. The fan turned slowly overhead. The bass settled into its nighttime sounds. The evidentiary record was complete. Tomorrow it would be time to let the pieces fall into place. Part 3. The Hawk Strikes. The summons came at 800 on the third day. Not to Sarah, not first. The message went to Hollister through official channels routed from JSOC operations through the base commander's office, requesting his presence in conference room C of the administrative block at 0900 for what the notification described as a routine joint operations review. The language was careful administrative, bearing no surface indication of what it actually was. The kind of language chosen specifically because it would not trigger the defensive instincts of a man who had spent 5 years developing them. Hollister read it twice. Then he called Partridge. Partridge did not answer. Partridge was already in the conference room when Hollister arrived, sitting in a chair against the wall with the posture of a man who had been told to sit there and had complied completely. He looked at Hollister when the door opened and then looked immediately away, which told Hollister everything he needed to know about the direction of the morning. The room held 6 people. General Lorraine Hartwell sat at the head of the table. She was 54 years old and carried herself with the economy of motion that belonged to people who had been in uniform long enough to understand that authority required no performance to be effective. 2 JSOC investigators occupied the chairs to her right, both in civilian clothes, both with the attentiveness of people who had already reviewed the materials and were now present to observe how the subject responded to them. Master Sergeant Orrin Bassett stood against the far wall with his arms folded. Lieutenant Commander Nate Wexford stood near the window. Sarah Decker sat in a chair to Hartwell's left. She was in full uniform, cover-off hands folded on the table in front of her. Her expression was the same expression she had worn for 3 days. Neutral, present, waiting. Hollister looked at her. He looked at her for 2 full seconds with the look of a man who had spent considerable effort constructing an understanding of a situation and had just encountered the fact that the understanding was wrong in its most fundamental assumptions. Then he looked at Hartwell and arranged his face into the expression of a senior officer arriving at a meeting he had not been adequately briefed for. General, I was not informed this would be a joint review. My JAG officer. Sit down, Colonel. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Hartwell's voice carried the quality of something that had been decided before it was spoken, and it moved through the room in a way that produced compliance without requiring anything further. Hollister sat down. Hartwell let the silence run for 5 seconds. Then she opened the folder in front of her. Colonel Dre Hollister, 24 years of service. Prior commands at Fort Jackson, Vicenza, and Fort Campbell. Current assignment, Joint Training Rotation Commander, Fort Liberty. She looked up at him. In your current assignment, you have authority over personnel decisions, training program design, resource allocation, and equipment assignments for the rotation. That authority is substantial. It is intended to be. Hollister said nothing. Colonel, are you familiar with the Ghost Hawk intelligence cell? The pause before his answer was 3/4 of a second. Every person in the room was trained to note it. In general terms, a covert reconnaissance unit, Syria and Iraq theater, 2017 to 2019. The operation was closed following a compromised mission. Aborted, Hartwell said. Not closed, there is a distinction. She looked at him steadily. The abort order for Operation Vulture was issued April 12, 2019. It was issued by you under the authority of your then current assignment as Senior Intelligence Coordination Officer for the Syria Theater Rotation. Correct. The mission was compromised. Intelligence indicated enemy forces had been alerted to our presence. I made the call to pull the team out. 3 operators died during that extraction, Hartwell said, because air support was redirected to an unrelated tasking. Because the exfiltration vehicles that were supposed to be staged at the extraction point were no longer there when the team reached it. She paused. The supporting documentation for your compromise assessment, the intelligence you cited as the basis for the abort, does not exist in the record. There is no source, no raw intelligence product, no corroborating assessment from any other officer in the chain. My sources were confidential. The nature of the mission required. Hartwell raised one hand, just slightly. The gesture was small enough that in another context it might have meant nothing. In this context, it stopped Hollister mid-sentence. She reached into the folder and removed a single printed page slid it across the table to him. This is a summary of financial records associated with the Delaware Registered Shell Company. The company was incorporated in 2018. The registered agent is listed under your wife's maiden name, Garrison. The company received periodic deposits over 6 years, amounts calibrated to remain below standard automated flagging thresholds. She let him look at the page. On April 10, 2019, 2 days before you issued the abort order for Operation Vulture, the company received a single deposit of $200,000. The source traces through a series of holding entities to a Cyprus-incorporated financial vehicle flagged by the DIOD Financial Intelligence Unit as part of the operational funding network for Alexei Braun. She let the name sit in the room. Hollister looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, calculating whether any available words did not make things worse. Braun, Hartwell continued, is an arms broker whose network has been an active procurement source for entities on the DoD watch list since 2015. One of those entities had an active interest in the failure of Operation Vulture because Vulture, had it succeeded, would have resulted in the capture of a logistics coordinator essential to Braun's procurement chain. She looked at Hollister. You received $200,000 2 days before you issued an abort order with no documented justification. 3 people died because of that order. The room was very quiet. Hollister's hands were flat on the table. His face had undergone a series of changes, moving from controlled professional neutrality through something that was briefly anger, and had settled into the stillness of a man who had arrived at the end of a road he did not realize he had been walking. That is circumstantial, he said. The words were steady, the instinct of a career doing the work his training had built him to do, constructing a defense because the instinct demanded it even when it was running on fumes. A financial connection to a name on a watch list is not. Hartwell reached into the folder again. She removed a small device. She set it on the table and pressed play. Hollister's own voice came out of it. She needs to go. I do not care how. Transfer failure make her life difficult enough that she requests transfer on her own. Just get her out of my camp. Partridge's voice, sir, if I may ask why the urgency, she has not caused any problems. Hollister's voice, because if she stays, people will start asking questions, and I cannot afford questions right now. Hartwell stopped the device. This conversation took place on the evening of Captain Decker's first full day at Fort Liberty. Captain Decker had been on base for less than 36 hours. She had not, as Major Partridge correctly noted, caused any problems. Hartwell looked at him with the colder thing that sat between anger and contempt. You received a notification 11 days before Captain Decker's arrival informing you that a JSOC asset had been reactivated and was likely heading to your installation. You did not know who that asset was, but you knew why any reactivated Ghost Hawk operative would come to Fort Liberty. She paused. So you moved against Captain Decker before she could establish herself, before she could build her case, before she could do the exact things she had already done. She slid a second document across the table. Hollister's email response to Partridge's forwarded notification. 3 lines. Hollister looked at them without touching the page. Hartwell let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, she is a federal investigator, operating under JSOC authority with full authorization to conduct this inquiry. The equipment she used was authorized. The communications she made were authorized. Every action she took during her time at this installation was authorized. Hartwell closed the folder. You, on the other hand, will surrender your credentials to the MPS waiting outside. The door opened. 2 military police officers entered. Hollister looked at them. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the printed financial summary still lying in front of him. He looked briefly at Partridge against the wall, who was studying the floor with the concentrated attention of a man trying to make himself smaller than his chair. This is a mistake, Hollister said. His voice had lost its calibration. The instrument that had made it a precision tool for 30 minutes had given way to something underneath it, something that sounded less like a colonel and more like a man. The evidence is incomplete. The connections you are drawing. Colonel, Hartwell stood. 3 people who trusted the chain of command above them went into an extraction that should have had support, and the support was not there because you made sure it was not. Her voice did not rise. It did the opposite. It became quieter, and the quiet made it heavier. You have the right to counsel. Use it. They led Hollister out of the room. The door closed. Sarah exhaled, not visibly, not in a way the room could catalog. An internal release of something that had been held at a specific tension for 3 days, for 5 years, for all the time since a phone call in 2019 had told her that 3 people she had worked alongside and trusted and been trusted by were not coming back. Hartwell looked at her. Then she removed one more document from the folder and held it. There is a matter of record we need to address. For the official account. She looked at Bassett briefly, then back at Sarah. Ghost Hawk Intelligence Cell. Operational from 2017 to 2019 in Syria and Iraq theater. The cell's training framework, its doctrine, and the specific skill profile of its operators derives substantially from a curriculum developed by one person. She set the document on the table. Chief Warrant Officer Gerald Decker, 75th Ranger Regiment, Fort Bragg, 2007 to 2011. Killed in action in Kunar Province, Afghanistan on March 14, 2011. His work formed the foundation of the program that his daughter completed in 2017 at the age of 22. Bassett looked at Sarah. He had been standing against the wall for 40 minutes, doing the thing he had done for 32 years, observing, processing, arriving at conclusions, with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that understanding was worth more than speed. He looked at Sarah now with an expression that was specific and contained. Not the broad emotion of a public moment, the narrow, deep thing that moved in a man's face when he was placing something he had carried for a long time in its correct position at last. He had known Gerald Decker. Not well, not closely. But he had served at Fort Bragg in 2009, and Gerald Decker had been there. And you knew the people at Bragg in 2009, the way you knew anyone in a specific place at a specific time by their reputation before you met them, and by the small confirming details of who they actually were after you did. Gerald Decker had been the kind of man whose reputation held up under close inspection, which was rarer than it should have been. He had died 2 years later on a hillside in Kunar Province, and Bassett had heard about it through the particular channel of loss that ran through a career's worth of service if you stayed long enough. Sarah was looking at the document on the table. Bassett did not speak. He did not nod meaningfully or let his expression open into something that would require management. He looked at Sarah for a moment with his arms still folded, with the face of a man who had arrived at a complete understanding and found that the understanding contained something worth honoring. And then he nodded once, small, precise, a nod that contained acknowledgement and respect and recognition all in the same small motion. A nod that said everything it needed to say and said none of it out loud because some things were diminished by being spoken. Sarah looked at him. For the first time in 3 days, something in her face opened slightly. Not much, not in a way that would have read from across the room, but it was there, the fractional change of someone receiving something they had not known they needed until the moment it was offered. She nodded back. The hallway outside Conference Room C was empty when Sarah walked out 40 minutes later. The formal statement had taken the time it took. She had answered every question with the precision of someone who had organized the answer long before the question was asked. The JSOC investigators had filled their notebooks. The record was complete. She stood in the hallway and let the silence settle around her for a moment. Footsteps from the far end of the corridor. She looked up. Corporal Reed Stovall was walking toward her. He was in uniform cover in his hands rather than on his head, the posture of someone approaching a conversation they were approaching as a person rather than as a rank. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the floor briefly and then at her directly with the difficulty of a man who had practiced what he was about to say and found in the moment of delivery that the practice was only partial preparation. Captain. He stopped. Tried again. I know there is nothing I can say that... He stopped again. His jaw moved. What I did on day one. In the formation. I need you to know that I know what that was. Sarah looked at him. She let the silence have a moment. I have been in this army for 4 years, Stovall said. I have followed orders my whole career. That is what you do. You follow orders, you trust the chain. And I stood there and I did what he said, and I did not ask myself a single question about what it actually was. He looked at her. That is not an excuse. I'm not telling you that so you will excuse it. I am telling you so you know I understand what I did. Sarah said, you were following orders from someone you trusted. It does not make it right, she said, but it is not nothing. There is a difference between the man who gives an order and the man who follows it without thinking. She paused. The difference is what you do when you start thinking. Stovall held his cover in both hands. He was quiet for a moment. I testified this morning to the investigators. Everything Hollister told me to do. The gear, the briefings, the orders to make the training exercises as difficult as possible for you specifically. He looked at her. All of it. I know, Sarah said. Something in Stovall's face moved. Not the clean landing of a man who had made amends and been absolved. Something more uncomfortable and more honest than that, the expression of a man who understood that accounting for something was not the same as undoing it, and who had decided the accounting still mattered even without the undoing. He nodded. He put his cover back on. He walked past her down the hallway, his footsteps carrying the weight of something he was going to carry for a while, which was the appropriate weight for what he had done with it. Wexford found her at the east end of the administrative block, standing near the exterior door that opened onto the side lot. She was looking out through the narrow window beside the door at the parking area, the tree line, the early afternoon sky. Her cover was in her hand. The composed stillness she had worn for 3 days was still there, but different now. The operational tension was gone from it. What remained was something older, the quiet that came from a long effort concluded. He stopped a few feet behind her. She heard him. She did not turn. "The general offered me an instructor position," she said. "SERE school, teaching survival and resistance to the next rotation." "I heard," Wexford said. "Reasonable offer." "Are you taking it?" She was quiet. "No." Wexford moved to stand beside her, looking out the same window at the same tree line. The lot was empty. A transport vehicle crossed at the far edge and disappeared. He had been thinking about what he wanted to say for 2 days since the shooting range, since he had placed the photograph on the bench and she had picked it up and set it back down. He had constructed several versions of the conversation in the part of his mind that ran these preparations, and each version had arrived at the same problem, which was that what he wanted to say was not something that could be organized into a version. It was a fact. Facts either got spoken or they did not. "Syria," he said. 2017, 7 years. "You turned out fine," Sarah said. Her voice was level, not dismissive. The words carried the weight of something that had been considered and meant. "That is not," he started. "You were 22 years old," she said. "You were doing your goss. Somebody should have been doing theirs to make sure you did not get blown up on a road that had already been flagged for IED activity, and somebody was not, and that was not your fault." She paused. "You were alive when the medevac arrived. That was enough. That was the job." Wexford was quiet for a moment. "It was not just the job." Sarah looked at him then. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had been unreadable for 3 days, and they were still not entirely readable now. But there was something in them that was present and direct and not hidden behind the operational neutrality that had covered everything else. "No," she said, "it was not." A pause. We were too young for that road. I am glad you made it through." She held his eyes for one more second. "Take care of this installation, Lieutenant Commander. There is good work left to do here." She pushed the door open and walked out. She left Fort Liberty at 04:30 the following morning, in the dark hour before the base began to wake up. Her duffel was packed with the same efficiency it had been unpacked 4 days earlier. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. The photograph was in the inside pocket of her jacket, where she had carried it since she was 16 years old. The recording device was in the exterior pocket of her bag evidence chain, documented and transferred to JSOC the afternoon before. The challenge coin she left on the desk. She stood over it for a moment in the dark room. The bass sounds were minimal at this hour, a distant engine, the steady background frequency of a large installation breathing in its sleep. The window was pale with the first gray that came before sunrise, not light yet, but the withdrawal of absolute dark, the hour that belonged to people who were moving before the world was ready to watch them. She looked at the coin, the hawk on the face, the number on the reverse. Her father had carried a version of this coin for the last 3 years of his life in the same interior pocket where she now kept his photograph, and she had found it in the effects box that arrived from Kunar province, with the rest of the things he had on his person when the helicopter went down. She had carried her own version of it since the day she completed the program he had built. She had thought when this was over that she would take it back with her, put it in her pocket beside the photograph, and carry both of them forward. But standing in the room in the gray pre-dawn light, she understood that the coin belonged here more than it belonged in her pocket now. It had done its work in this room. It had served as the last visible piece of what had passed through Fort Liberty, not as a trophy, not as a memorial, but as a marker. The kind that said something had been here and had moved on, and the movement had mattered. She stepped back from the desk. She picked up her duffel. She walked out. The motor pool was empty. She started the assigned vehicle, let the engine run for a minute, and pulled out of the gate at 0434 without stopping. The duty sergeant noted her departure on the log without comment. The base grew smaller in the rearview mirror. The lights of it receded into the Carolina dark. She drove east for 12 minutes before she pulled onto a shoulder access road and stopped. She opened her laptop. The inbox showed one new message. The sender address was a string of characters that resolved to nothing through a standard lookup, but resolved correctly with the decryption key she had carried for 5 years. The subject line was blank. She opened it. The body was 11 lines. She read them once. She read them again, not because the meaning was unclear, but because some information required 2 passes before the full weight of it settled. Hollister was a customer. The text said it with the flat certainty of a JSOC operations message, verified before it was sent. Hollister had paid for a service, and the service had been the abortion of an operation, and those who had paid for it were still operational. The Braun network was active, not dormant, not reduced. Active, meaning functional, meaning currently in the business of the thing it had always been in the business of. 3 names: logistics officers stationed at MacDill Air Force Base, Florida, ranks and assignments listed. The connecting thread between them, outlined in 4 sentences representing months of financial intelligence work, compressed into the minimum space required to communicate what mattered. The final line: Operation Nightfall, Phase 2. Authentication, Tango Hotel, November. Report by 0600 Monday. She closed the laptop and set it on the passenger seat. She sat in the dark for a moment with her hands resting on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the empty road ahead. The tree line on either side of the access road was a dark mass against the sky that was moving from gray toward the first suggestion of color. She thought about the 3 operators from 2019. Not their faces, which she could reconstruct with the precision of long acquaintance, but their voices. The compressed efficiency of communication under pressure. The small habits that distinguished one person from another, even in the most functional of exchanges. They had been operators, all 3 of them, which meant they had understood exactly what they were doing and why, which meant they would not have wanted what happened to them to be the place where the work stopped. The work did not stop. Hollister was finished. The record was complete. The system had been shown its failure with enough specificity and enough evidence that the showing could not be filed away and ignored, and that was the harder thing to accomplish, and the more important one, because one arrest changed one man's future, and an exposure changed the conditions that had made the man possible. But Hollister was a customer. Customers implied a seller. And the seller was still operational at MacDill Air Force Base, with 3 faces attached to it, and the money that had bought the abort of Operation Vulture was somewhere in a trail that led backward to those 3 faces and forward to whatever they were currently arranging to sell. Sarah started the vehicle. She pulled back onto the road and drove east toward the airfield, toward the sunrise assembling itself in pale bands above the tree line. Master Sergeant Orrin Bassett arrived at Sarah's quarters at 0700. He had known she would be gone before he got there. He had known it the way he had come to know several things over the past 3 days, through experience and attention that he was only now understanding had been insufficient until recently. He had seen enough to build a working model of how Sarah Decker operated, and the model told him clearly that she did not stay in places after the work in those places was done. He pushed open the door she had left unlocked. The room was exactly as it had been when she arrived, a space that contained institutional furniture and no personal presence at all. Nothing to indicate that anyone had lived in it for 4 days except the slight indentation in the center of the mattress and the specific quality of absence that a space acquired when it had been occupied by someone and then was not. He crossed to the desk. The challenge coin sat on the corner exactly where it had been the morning he first found this room empty, when he had stood over it and run the math on something he did not yet have the full picture to solve. He had turned it over with one finger and read the number on the reverse and filed it as a data point without context. He had the context now. He picked it up. The metal was cool from the night air. The hawk on the face was worn smooth in the places where a thumb rested naturally, thousands of repetitions in the dark, in difficult places, in the specific hours when what you were doing had to be enough reason to keep doing it. The text around the base of the wings was small, precise, the kind of detail that required an engraver who understood that the scale of the inscription did not diminish its weight. He turned it to the reverse, GH-07114. Below the serial number, 2 words he had not noticed the first time, smaller than the number itself, engraved with the quality of something added after the initial work was done. Forgotten. Remembered. He stood with the coin in his palm for a long time. He thought about Gerald Decker at Fort Bragg in 2009, and the way a man's reputation traveled in that environment, and the way Gerald's had traveled well and held up under close inspection. He thought about a 16-year-old girl who had received a box of effects from Kunar province and had built from what was inside it a trajectory that had led her to a parade ground in North Carolina 13 years later, where she had stood in torn clothing in front of 60 people and breathed through it and said nothing and noted everything and waited with the patience of someone who understood the difference between the pace that urgency demanded and the pace that justice required. He thought about the three operators from the 2019 extraction whose names were in the JSOC records and whose faces he did not know, but whose work he understood now in the specific way that you understood work when you saw the shape of the absence it had left behind. He thought about a woman driving east on a Carolina highway in the early morning toward an airfield, toward a plane, toward whatever came next in the chain of accountability that was not finished but was moving steadily towards something. Bassett placed the coin back on the corner of the desk. He set it hawk side up at the same angle Sarah had left it. He took a step back. He looked at it for the last time. Then he walked to the wall switch, turned off the light, and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him. The coin sat in the dim room. The morning light from the window found the surface at an angle and held it the way light found certain things and held them as if it understood they were worth illuminating. The hawk on the face, the worn smooth places, the two words on the reverse that said everything a serial number could not. East of Fort Liberty, on a highway running toward an airfield, a vehicle moved at a steady pace through the new day. The woman driving it was thinking about three names on a classified document and the distance remaining between where she was and where she needed to be. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The work continued.